we share these streets, true tales of everyday folk in bygone Nottingham. Episode 13. Edward.
In 1841, the village of Newton in Lincolnshire was a small and sleepy place. The population was around 200 people. There was a spring nearby whose waters had a high iron content and was rumoured to have health-giving properties. The Newton church was built upon the site of an earlier church mentioned in the Domesday Book. It was dedicated to St. Botolph, patron saint of travel and trade. There was also, of course, a pub, and that was the Red Lion. In 1841, this was owned by Edward and Harriet, and they'd just had a son, also named Edward. Edward Sr. passed away 6 years later, and in 1851 we found that Harriet was running the pub on her own. Her son, young Edward, was 10 at this time and at school. We don't know the exact year, but at some point Edward began working as a travelling salesman for a Nottingham business, Thomas Chatwind and Son, a tea and provision merchant based at the southern end of Wheelergate. That part of Wheelergate was unofficially an extension of St. Peter's Square. We don't use the term St. Peter's Square a lot nowadays, but you probably know the area I mean. It's the junction of Exchange Walk, St. Peter's Gate, Albert Street, Houndsgate and Wheelergate. In the late 1980s and 1990s, xylophone man Frank Robinson often performed there, with his back to St. Peter's Church. In bygone times, churches were central to lives in a settlement, and St. Peter's was no different. The current building is thought to date from around 1180 AD. There was a previous incarnation of the church thought to have existed from 1100 AD, but this was destroyed by fire. In 1789, the weather vane atop St. Peter's spire became unsafe. A man named Robert Wootton from Kegworth agreed to take it down and replace it. He climbed a ladder from the roof to the steeple with another balanced on his shoulder, which he then secured to reach the top, where he repaired the spire and vane. Local legend has it that sometime shortly after, Robert relived his daring deed to entertain the crowds below. He climbed and stood at the very summit, which was only 13 inches in diameter, and performed a number of antics, including beating a drum and downing a pint of strong Nottingham ale. He was rewarded with rapturous applause and financial donations from the open-mouthed crowd below. There had been a tram terminus in St. Peter's Square for the southern branch of the city's tram network, taking passengers to and from the train station and the meadows. There was also a municipal building which housed the Corporation City Accountant Department and the Corporation Water Department at the turn of the century. St. Peter's Square was also a market area where items were traded on stalls. On May 4th, 1948, the Nottingham Evening Post published a letter which featured the following description of bygone St. Peter's Square.
In the 1870s, St. Peter's Square and Gate was one of the principal assembly spots for the carriers' carts, which came from all the villages around every Wednesday and Saturday, and on those days St. Peter's Square, which was then smaller than it is now and had a large lamp standard with, I believe, 3 or 4 lights on it in the middle of the square, accommodated anything from 12 to 20 carriers' carts. These carts were drawn into the square and the horses taken away to the stables of the various inns, which in those days were so numerous in the vicinity. The carts remained in St. Peter's Square all day, whilst the carriers went around the town delivering the parcels they had brought in from the country. They usually left an assistant with the van who sold country produce such as butters, eggs and fresh fruit, which had been entrusted to the carriers by the country folk to sell on their behalf. You will therefore see that there was quite a little market in St. Peter's Square every Wednesday and Saturday, and the scene must have been a very busy and interesting one. I do not think there were any queues in those days, and although the space in which these operations were directed was restricted, everyone seems to have got what they wanted, without any inconvenience.
One wonders if Edward became aware of Thomas Chatwind and Sons via the market. He may have been one of the out-of-towners and travelled to Nottingham from Newton with the carriers. Thomas Chatwind and Sons had been trading since 1847, but by 1871 Edward had become so successful that he purchased the business and renamed it Edward Swann and Co. We found Edward lodging on Postern Street, which still exists and is up near the Rope Walk. In 1872 he married a woman called Mary from Ashby de la Lund, a Lincolnshire village about 14 miles of Newton. Mary's home village had an interesting connection to the famous Knights Templar. In 1150, the lord of the manor founded a preceptory named Temple Brewer after joining the Knight Templar. In 1881 there was a census, and we find Edward and Mary firmly established on Wheelergate with 4 young sons, 3 grocer's assistants, 1 apprentice grocer and 3 domestic servants. In November 1886, the Evening Post carried a short notice which read, "E. Swann & Co., grocers, having let 2 front shops, will carry on their business in new warehouses, entrance Wheelergate." Edward had employed a Nottingham architect, Robert Evans, to redesign the Wheelergate buildings to better suit the growing business and family. Robert Evans was a prolific architect. In the 1850s, he had been tutored by Thomas Chambers Hine, with whom he worked in partnership between 1857 and 1867. Some of his works still visible around Nottingham include the Imperial Fire and Life Insurance Building at 16 to 18 Victoria Street, the Hart, Fellows and Company Bank on Bridlesmith Gate, the Pretty Windows Pub on Southall Street, and the Cross Key Pub on Fletcher Gate. The new premises reflected the company's success. They were known as Swann's buildings and included 2 retail units which were rented out to different businesses, and the main part at the rear, which was Edward's warehouse for the wholesale business. A spacious residence was above. Wheelergate at the time housed a diverse variety of enterprises, from solicitors, accountants, brick manufacturers, a couple of hotels, architects, brewers, wine merchants, fishmongers, restaurants, the Jones Sewing Machine Company, surveyors, earthenware and drainpipe manufacturers, and the Nottingham and County Liberal Club. Offshoots of Wheelergate include Brougham Chambers, Town Club Chambers, Eldon Chambers and Midland Chambers. Both Wheelergate and St. Peter's Square were busy locations, and Edward's business thrived. Between 1873 and 1887, Edward and Mary had 8 children in total, 6 sons and 2 daughters. In 1889, Edward joined the De Vere Lodge of the Freemasons. Just a few years later, on 16th of April 1891, Edward passed away and left an estate valued at £8,105. In modern times, that would be the equivalent of just over £1 million. The business was purchased by Mr. Arthur Richardson, who had actually worked at Swann & Co. as an apprentice since 1877. In time, the business moved to Friar Yard off Friar Lane, and in 1914 to Newcastle Buildings on Castle Boulevard. When Thomas Chatwind started his business in 1847, I wonder if he could have imagined how successful it would be, not only for himself, but also the Swanns and later the Richardsons. The success at the site has continued over the decades. The building that Robert Evans designed for Edward is still standing. It's 25 to 29 Wheelergate, and is generally known as being the old Sissons and Parker's bookshop, which became a Hudson's, a Dillon's and a Waterstones, but since 2017 has been a mini Sainsbury's. If you stand on the opposite side of Wheelergate and look up at the roofline of the building, you'll see a shield or cartouche on the left with 2 initials engraved on it, ES for Edward Swann.
Thanks there to Steve Oliver for another excellent reading. I first became aware of the Edward Swann story when in the 1990s I had the pleasure of meeting Charles Swann. His dad was William, who was Edward and Mary's 3rd child. Charles was elderly when I met him, but had a very young spirit and an active mind. We got chatting through a mutual friend, and when I mentioned my interest in Nottingham history, he was very forthcoming with details of his granddad. I can still remember him excitedly telling me to look up for his granddad's initials on the building, and the pride when he told me about the success of the business. In researching the episode, we discovered that Charles passed away in 1996, which was not long after we chatted. I met Charles and his wife Winifred only that once, sadly, but I'm so happy that I did. They were both absolutely lovely people. Hopefully this episode will keep the story going for a little while longer.